Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 375 of my modded Factorio playthrough. Rocket launches are continuing here. We're up to 146, both launches and satellites. But some of the satellites aren't making it in here, so there's a little slowdown. I mean, this thing is going, but, well, shortage of glass, I suppose that makes sense. Having a second set of requests might help a little bit, but ultimately, if we're short on glass, then we're short on glass. And this machine doesn't have to go constantly. It just needs to go fast enough to keep the satellites caught up. And now it's actually falling behind on the RTGs a little bit. I don't think it really needs all of this, but let's buff it up a bit. Because we at least want to try to catch up. Because every satellite that's in there is being requested right now. We're actually launching these pretty fast, but I suppose right now we're launching them as fast as we can put them in this chest because we were overloaded on rockets with nothing to put in them. But it looks like we caught up because they're all gone now. One thing that occurred to me is that as we run out of curium, all of our thorium reactors are essentially going to shut off. And that was the original plan, and that's fine because then the power is going to fall back to uranium if it's available, and then to plutonium as the final backup. But the problem here is the plutonium setup only puts out about 8 gigawatts. And right now that's more or less fine because our research has slowed down because we're short on glass. But previously when it was 20 or 30 gigawatts, that's way too much for the plutonium setup. So are we just going to have to expand this for that? That seems kind of overkill, especially considering that these plutonium reactors only actually need to run in order to create the curium for our thorium setup. Because right now, thorium is our primary source of power, so everything should be in service of that. And right now, how we're controlling this is we're sending the A signal along the entire plutonium setup, and then it has to be below 15% to allow for an inserter swing. And those conditions are correct, but we need an additional condition here. One is if the accumulators are less than 15%, but the other is also if we have too few curium. But kind of the problem here is there's really not a lot of space for an extra accommodator in here, and also these setups just weren't designed to run that way. So we can actually put a patch in here because they're running based on the status of the A signal. So to do this correctly, we're going to have to wire it in a different way. But that's fine, we just need 2 more accommodators here. One arithmetic and one decider. The decider here is going to pull in the curium signal, and although this wire has all of the signals on it, this will have no issue pulling off the individual signal, curium. The reason why it's being pulled off for this wire is just so it's easier to read when we hover over it. But if curium is less than a specified amount, let's say 100, and then if this condition is true, we will output an A signal, just the 1, which means we are now getting 1A. Then we'll put an arithmetic combinator in line and say A times minus 100. And the output will be A. So let's connect these two together. So now our output signal is negative 100 of A. So what this means is if we hook it back up to the input signal, it is going to pull A down to somewhere between 0 and negative 100. And that is going to be much lower than 15, which will force all of these reactors to turn on. And there they go. Because A is negative 46, so they will always be on. And if this was done correctly, only plutonium will be on. And that seems to be true, except the 234 is using that same signal for their combinator because it was easy. So we're going to have to pull it off in a different way. And I suppose this is as good a time as any to get this out of the road. And there we go. Now all the 234 shut off because the accumulators are just actually at the point of being high enough, because I think they shut off at 65%. So, success there. So now we're going to have to wait a little while because it needs to go through all of its plutonium. And looks like we're just 2 rocket launches away from the first stage here. And this process is actually kind of slow. So perhaps watching it is not ideal. And 1 rocket launch away. So which rocket is it going to be? And when this launches, all further launches are going to stop because right now our logic is looking at the requirements for this stage of SpaceX. And right now it's only 1. So after we launch another one, the requirement will be 0 and the inserters will stop swinging, and then we'll need to change the logic. Here it is. There might be an overlap of rockets here. I think the rocket actually has to finish its launch first, so yeah. Technically they both got it, so... And that's going to happen, that with our launches, we might create slightly too many parts. But that's okay, we just don't want to make, like, warehouses full of them. Oh, they launched pretty much exactly at the same time. So there we go. Finally, after multiple launches of satellites, you come to the realization of what the final solution will look like. The final solution. That's ominous. Complete eradication of the natives, and time to build your own ride out of here. It's the only way to be sure. So a couple more rockets got launched, but now these inserters are no longer getting their signal, because now our output signals is S2 for the second stage, so we could control these based on what stage that they're in. But ultimately, we are going to need 250 dry dock structure components and 50 dry dock assembly components. So now that we have our satellite network, we have to build the structure in space that's actually going to build our rocket ship. We don't want to waste too much time, because once these rockets are ready to go, we will be building no more, and that's wasting time. So here's the components. The easy one is the dry dock structural component, which we need 250 of. It is simply low density structure. The other thing that we're going to need a lot of is the dry dock assembly component, which requires a lot of assembly robots, which is a problem in itself, but also the 250 large solar panels. That's going to be an issue. And the rockets are getting ready. And the assembly robot is simply Construction Robot 4 with some low density structure. Although it is 5 Construction Robot 4s. The rockets are getting ready, but they have no inventory. So they're just going to wait on us to fix the logic here. I suppose we should fix that logic, because that would allow the rockets to continue to launch while we are creating these next components. Because essentially, we have no idea how fast we're going to make the spaceship components, but if there's a rocket ready to go, we don't want to waste time and just have it sit there, because we're going to need to launch 2,000 plus satellites in order to get our space science. So we need to control the inserter on which items that it puts in the silo. Ideally, we would want to put the spaceship components in first, but if there are no spaceship components, either they are not available in the chest or they are no longer required for the construction, we would want to keep putting satellites in there so we can keep building science, because eventually we're going to need about 2 million of it. So it's really inefficient for time to have rockets just kind of sitting here and waiting just because we're on the next stage of rocket launch. Because if we had logic here, it would have put the satellite in the rocket and it would have just launched. But instead it's not, because it's waiting for spaceship parts. So how filter inserters work when it comes to what item they pick up depends on the amount in the signal. So let's say we had a couple of items we wanted to move. How about aluminum and copper plates? So let's put a stack inserter in here just to see which one it moves first, so we can invert that behavior. It does copper first. So let's say we didn't want that to be the case. So we can put a constant combinator in here to simulate some signals. And the way that this works is the priority is based on whatever number is bigger. So since we want aluminum first, how about we do 100 aluminum and then 10 copper? This isn't setting any amounts for how much the inserter is going to move. What it's doing is saying the priority of the signals. And since aluminum is higher, it will now be inserted before the copper. But this is a filter inserter, so it needs to have actual filters. So if we connect it and say set filters, now the aluminum comes first and then the copper. So we can do something similar to this for our spaceship parts. And wow, just while talking for a few minutes and almost all the rockets are ready. So it's going to be a lot of launches. So we'll plop it down here that it's sending 2 signals for our SpaceX parts here. But we need to make this a little more complicated than it is now. So first we need some decider combinators here, and then we'll insert the signal into them. So what we want to do is convert these number requirements to priority. If we did nothing and just attach it like it is, then dry dock structure components would launch first, and then the assembly components. I mean, that's fine, but the problem is we also want it to launch satellites. So what happens when it gets down to one part of each? Then all of them would have equal priority, and we would have issues. So we need to both create a priority and also disable priorities when parts are no longer required. We have the dry dock structural component, and while we're here, we might as well add priority for every single part. There could be a priority of which parts we'd want to launch first, but instead of worrying about that, it might be easier just to calculate for all of them right now. So we have a total of 12 component types we would need to launch up, which means we're going to need to have 12 of these. So let's try to make something that would work. It would be kind of like this, and it might be a little cleaner if we just went around to the other side here. And we want to give it a priority. So we will say if this part exists in the signal, so it's greater than 0, or in other words, we need at least one of them, then you can output one of them. Guess we're going to need more space here because we need some more combinators. And because it's needed, there's now a 1. And we essentially need to do the same thing for each item type. There we go, that's the top half anyway. So now you look at the output signals, most of them are 0, but we are getting 1 of the 2 components that we need. Now, we need to put some arithmetic combinators in here to actually convert that signal into a priority. So we'll put them in here, but only have the wire going across and not shared, because this is going to be a unique calculation for each part. So the priority is from high to low, so we will want a higher number for higher priority. And who knows what the ideal priority for all this would be? It probably doesn't matter in the end, but the only thing we need to remember is that the priority for the satellite is lower than all of the parts. And since there is a total of 12 parts, plus the satellite, which makes 13, then it means we need to have 13 levels of priority. So we'll start from 13 and work our way down. So if this signal exists, because it's made it across here, which it has, we will need to give it the priority. And since the number is 1, we can just multiply it by whatever we want the priority to be. So we can say, we want it to be 13, and the output is the same part. So now, if we look at the output signal is 13. So we need to do the same thing for all parts, but as we go down, reduce the priority by 1. Okay, that's the top half. Now we kind of need to do the same thing on the bottom. Try to make it as nice and neat as we can get away with here. Okay, and finally, the faster than light drive on the bottom. So we have all of these. Of course, all their signals are going to be 0 because we don't have any of those. But we also need to send the signal across to get those priorities placed in. So that one is at 8, so we need to count down from there. And finally, the faster than light times 2. And now we can combine all of these signals. And let's put a pole right here, because that gives us something we can hover over. So you can see we have a 13 signal for the assembly component and a 12 signal for the dry dock structural component. And let's do a constant combinator in here to test. So let's say, what happens if we built all of the dry dock assembly components? So let's put the dry dock assembly component in there and say -50 to simulate that we have launched all that we need. And that combines with the +50 to make 0, which means that signal no longer makes it through. And now we only have the other signal. So we can kind of test all this by putting a test inserter here and connecting it and saying set filters. So you see that the dry dock structural component is the only thing on the list. Well, what happens if we turn this test signal off? Now, the assembly component is back, but it is in the front of the list because its priority was higher than the structural component. So the last thing we need to add to all of this is the satellite signal. Adding the satellite's a lot easier because we essentially always want it to be the lowest possible priority. So we can do that by just saying satellite is 1, and we don't have to do any calculation because that's already the priority that we want to do. So we add it. Of course, have to turn it on. And now that we do so, the satellite is in the whitelist. And it will give priority to these other components if they are available. But if not, it'll swing for a satellite. And we can show what would happen over time, where let's say we got all of those components and all of these. Now, the inserter will just be left with satellites. So that's the logic there. Now the other component is the request itself. So we'll need to make logistics requests for every one of these items. Although that said, items that are in logistics requests do not count as items that are in the network because they're technically not available. And actually, let's see what's happening with plutonium here, that we now have our 100 pieces of curium, and the plutonium setup has shut off. So that logic worked to make sure that we will always have enough curium for our thorium setup to run normally. But the reason why I was thinking about plutonium and all our other reactor setups is that if you use a buffer chest, you can make a request for an item, but also have it included in the total number of items that are in the network. Because when you're checking to see how many items you have, such as we're doing here to calculate the average number of fuel cells per reactor, it's pulling that off the robot network. But if they're in requester chests, it won't show up. So all of those had to be switched to buffer chests. So if we want to avoid making too many items, then we need to make sure the spaceship parts are actually in buffer chests. Because if they're not, and they're in requester chests, then all of these requester chests will fill up with one spaceship part. I mean, that's not the worst thing in the world, but it does mean we're going to need to make 20 more spaceship parts than are minimally required. And some of them can get quite expensive. So we'll use a buffer chest for this, and just say we want one of every spaceship part. And of course, all these are red because we're not making any of them right now. But by using the buffer chest, all of these parts that are in the buffer chests will be included in the network. So there's the 12 parts, but we need a 13th part, and that's the satellite. And of course that request will be met. And its logic will just be this filter inserter. But we're going to need to get the wires attached, so while we haven't, it won't work correctly. We don't actually have these parts available anyway, so it doesn't really matter. We just need to get them back in the rockets so launches begin. And we're going to get a lot of launches very quickly here. Let's try to do it in such a way where they basically all launch at the same time. So we'll just drop all these in here, and we're about to get a lot of noise. Here we go. Wonder where it put all of those satellites, because it seems like it's going from really far away to get them. Yeah, it says, oh, well, they're all in our inventory. Well, that explains it. The supply chest is also a buffer chest, so that is why it wasn't pulling from here. So we actually need to make that a passive provider. There we go. Actually, this was probably a pretty effective way of getting all these to launch at the same time. Oh, they're still going. Okay. Well, I suppose we could leave the logic here. There's no reason to actually move it anywhere. Now we just got to get all these wires connected. And will they reach? That does not. So there we go. Production is back to normal. And now we have some logic to hopefully make us launch the spaceship parts first. And I guess we'll test this pretty much right now. And it's not really going to work in the same way as the satellite, because with the satellite we essentially always want them. Looks like we're a little short on radar 5, but I imagine it's basically running fine. It's just short on the resources. Let's add a bunch more in there to hopefully smooth that out a bit, since it's robot logistics. And we dipped below 100 curium again, which means the plutonium reactors are now running. So great. That seems to be quite smooth. And we're even building up some uranium now. And that makes sense because burning plutonium actually creates a little bit of 235. But the accumulators are really charged right now, so we have a collection of fuel available. So between these two spaceship parts, the easiest one is the dry dock structural component. So that'll probably be the quick and easy way to test our system here. So we'll grab something for now. But it's also more complicated than that, because unlike satellites where we always want them to be available because there's no limit to how many of them we're willing to launch, there is a limit to how many spaceship parts we're going to launch. And in this case, it's 250, but we can also use the SpaceX Combinator to tell us exactly how many we still need to do. So by running this by itself, it tells us we need 250. So let's grab a logistics zone interface, and we'll find a way to making all this nice and dense in a bit. We'll do an arithmetic combinator pulling the status of those components, the dry dock structural components, multiplied by -1. And then the output will be the same. So that's turning all of the components that are in the network and in chests next to rockets as a negative number. So if we combine what we need, which is a positive number, with what we have, that's a negative number. What's left is how many we still need. So if it's a positive number, then it means we still need parts. And if it's a negative number, then it means we have too many and essentially have enough in the network to eventually satisfy the request. And it's kind of hard to see here because of all of the junk in their network, so we can kind of put it on this wire now to just see what's going on. So nothing's really changed because we don't have any of these parts. But do we always want to keep making parts? For example, if we don't stop it, is it fine for us to have an entire chest full of parts because the rockets aren't available yet? It wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but it's probably unwise, just because that's a lot of resources that we can't do anything with that potentially could go towards something else. Not to mention, what happens if there's an error with our logic? Then the chest will be completely full of parts, and then we'll only figure it out when we're like, why aren't we launching anything? And then we see we have a chest full of junk. So we probably should still have some old-fashioned logic of only fill it up so much, please. We'll just do a passive provider and say only fill it up to, say, 10. And we can change that as required. And we probably could design this in such a way where it's super compact, but that's also not really required. So we'll connect our output here, but we do need to clean this signal up. So we need to put another combinator here to just do multiplied by 1 and have the output. Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of junk in our signal. And let's attach this here to make sure it works right. All we're getting is the positive 250 for the components that we need. So we can also test this by connecting this right here, and we can simulate having these components in the network somewhere. So let's say we have 150 of these components in the network somewhere. Now, the final number is 100. So that logic is working correctly. So now the final number is there and it has been curated. So we can just say anything greater than 0. So as long as we have a positive signal, it means we still need more of these parts and to keep assembling them. It's got its modules. So we can just do a requester chest with 1,000. Well, that's too many. Probably want it basically maxed out. Let's do like 400. And since this is going to happen relatively quickly, we can just kind of follow the process to make sure that it goes to where it needs to. And then we'll know that any other things we do will also work correctly. So that's actually a lot of parts, because that's a lot of low density structure in here. But it doesn't have to run super fast, because with this kind of logic, we can actually make multiple kinds of components at the same time. And they will just be launched based on whatever the priority ends up being. But it's making the part. There it is. A robot requested it. So let's follow him. Now it's in here, and it's already got a satellite. So to test this, we need to see what happens when the rocket gets filled up. Well, I guess we'll just watch this first one here. It might not be the very first one that launches. And we'll also see the update on here that structure components are making it into space. But I would like to actually see the inserter swing. It's a little more satisfying to see something actually work than just have a number go up on a screen. And just about there. So we should see the spaceship component inserted. And there it is. So our logic priority correctly worked. I don't know if we should be standing this close to this. It's a video game, it doesn't matter. A chain of rockets. And there they go. And just like that, we are launching structure components. So we just let that continue. So the other part we need to make is the dry dock assembly component, which is quite expensive and made from assembly robots. And the assembly robots come from construction robots. So we do have some direct insertion that can happen here. Let's just pull that robot zone out because we don't need it. So the first part of this is the assembly robot element. So it's making the request for most of the things, but it is not requesting construction robots because those would actually need to be in a chest to be requested. And this does require that we kind of change how we're doing robots a little bit. And one flaw that is showing itself in the late game is that we only build logistics robots when we're short on them. And back in the day, we had close to 10,000 logistics robots, but now we're down to less than 3,000 because it only actually builds them when we've used them all up. And then once we have even one free one, it stops making them. So that means that the number is perpetually going down. So I think at this point, instead of building our logistics robots based on the availability, we should just do it in the raw sense. Fixing the logistics bots is easy because instead of using the X signal of available logistics bots, let's switch it to Y for the total logistics bots. And let's say if we have less than 10,000 of them, this setup will turn on and continue to produce robots. Running this one is a little more difficult because we need to have a selection of construction robots right here available for requests. So first, let's switch these to storage chests. So they'll still make it here like normal, but we want it to have a lower priority. So the spaceship parts will work correctly, and it looks like the robots are making it to the end here, where we want to have a passive provider, and that this is trying to run it until, let's say, it's up to 500. And now we want our active provider chests with another inserter. Let's say that it has to be above 250. So if it's less than 250, the robots will stay in here, and then they will be pulled in for construction. And if there's more, it will swing. So now we need to force the construction of construction bots when we don't actually need any in the network. So if we put an arithmetic combinator here and say the input is just construction robot force times 1 and have an output, we can use it to figure out how many are in the network. And we'll set this to read logistics network contents. And how about we send the signal up to this pole just so we can see that it's 0, because the robots that are flying around are not in the logistics network because they're not available for use as an item, because they're flying around doing stuff. So there is a second condition that will cause this inserter to swing. Besides the factory being low on construction robots, it will also swing if the amount of construction robots that are inside that chest is low. So we'll say less than 250 robots output a green square. And now we are getting that green square. And this inserter will run if it has any green square from either of those conditions. And now that it has it, it's swinging. And it looks like this inserter is set to 250 as well, so that we don't create any extras. How about we just lower this number to like 200, And this has to be greater than 250. And it needs to be in anything, so it stops swinging. And there we go. So we are now getting construction robots in this chest, and they are finding their way back here for this. And we're still making our structure components. And launches are continuing. So everything looks good here. So let's plop this here, making the next stage, which uses those assembly robots. We can do direct insertion. However, we are going to need this same logic now for this new component. And it's giving a positive signal to swing. So we'll throw the request in here. It doesn't need robot parts. Of course, it's asking for a ton of other stuff that is just crazy. It's just a very expensive building. 1,000 solar panels. How about let's put enough in here for 2 constructions. 400 solar panels and 20 roboports. So we enable that and it will make it here. We'll probably have to buff up our solar panels, but Roboport 1s. We never made those because we never used the original Roboport. So that's something we need to put in here. And that is actually an issue because I disabled the vanilla Roboports just because I wasn't going to use them. And that setting is right here, the disable Roboports. So we'll want to revert it back to the default value. Okay, we're back. And now they have been added in again. And the Roboport is actually made with robot parts, which makes sense. So building it here is unwise, since all of those parts are actually up here. And there it goes, as long as it can, because it's reliant on all those machines too. So coming back here again, it's getting all of its junk that it needs, which means we should be able to launch. But of course, after enabling that, now the required Roboport is number 4, because of course it is. I mean, that makes sense, but it's annoying that the recipe changed. Okay then. I guess we'll just do a line of Roboports here. They're making it to the back here. And it got picked up. And there we go. So we'll let this thing put an absolutely massive amount of everything in here. Luckily, we only need 50 of these rather than 250. And there we go. Making the part. And it got picked up. And placed in this silo here. That's actually pretty close to launch. And it just so happened that the way these filters are set up is that the dry dock assembly component is first, because we gave that the 13 priority. Then it means when this is ready to launch, it should pick that first, which does make sense because it is the harder thing to make, so we'd want to launch those first. And lots of launches are going to be happening here, but let's see what it swings. Step away a little bit because a lot of noise. But it picked up the assembly component because it had higher priority. So, all good, and you can see that one dry dock assembly component was launched. So, that all worked. Looks like we are getting attacked by lots of biters, causing some lag. And that's because the pollution is pretty bad. The farms are helping, but at some point, it's just not enough anymore. Wow. Well, we need all these orbs, so it's actually not the end of the world for this, because at some point we're going to need untold amounts of orbs. But that said, still, the Arboretums are doing what they can, and as far as where we're getting the pollution from, it's all chemical plant 4s, which are either the rocket fuel, which it very well could be, or the batteries, which have stopped, so I suppose it's just continuing along here. And more accumulators have been placed, which means time for even more. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to do a massive upgrade to glass in order to feed our blue science setup, as well as witness the factory hit 50 gigawatts of power consumption. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.